I stood in the narrow hallway of my childhood home, surrounded by smiling faces that weren't mine. Photos lined the walls: Sarah's graduation, Sarah in her wedding dress, Sarah holding her newborn daughter. Not a single picture of me. I couldn't even spot one from my college graduation, let alone the time I bought my first condo or gave birth to my son, Eli. It was like I didn't exist. After 36 years, I should have been used to it, but that familiar sting in my chest told me otherwise. From the kitchen, my mother's voice carried with the clink of silverware. "Melanie, is that you? Come help with these appetizers. Sarah will be here soon." Of course, everything was always about Sarah. I took a breath and walked in. Mom was fussing over a tray of mini quiches like it was the Queen's visit, not Sarah's promotion party. Sarah, my younger sister, had just been made branch manager at a credit union, thanks to one of Dad's friends pulling strings. Meanwhile, I'd worked my way from food stamps to financial advisor, solo parenting along the way. Mom didn't notice my hesitation. She shoved a dish towel at me. "Your father bought the wrong crackers. She hates plain, wants sesame. Honestly, does anyone listen around here?" I silently took over, arranging food while she vanished to change into something celebration-worthy. I'd heard this script before a different event. Same roles. Me in the background, Sarah in the spotlight. My phone buzzed. A text from Leah, my ex-husband's sister, and, somehow, the only one still checking in. "Did you tell them yet?" I hadn't. Not because I was scared, at least. That's what I told myself, but because breaking up with your own parents isn't something that comes naturally. Especially not when you've been funding their mortgage, car payments, and credit cards for years. The front door creaked. Dad walked in, set down a wine bag, and barely glanced at me. "Where's your mother?" "Upstairs. Sarah will be here soon." He gave a curt nod and walked right past me, not even a hi. Not even a "how's Eli?" I stared down at the tray of quiches, remembering the last time I'd stood in this exact kitchen 6 months ago, when they suddenly started calling me weekly, inviting us over, asking about Eli, even offering to babysit. For a second, I believed they'd finally come around. Then Sarah got her promotion, and all that fake warmth made sense. They needed money. I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. The clatter of heels on hardwood snapped me out of my daze. Mom breezed back in, now wearing a blouse one recognized. I'd bought it for her during last year's birthday sale at Macy's. "Did you finish those? Sarah will be here any minute. We need to talk," I said, sliding the tray toward her. Her smile faltered. "Now?" "Yes, I'm done covering your bills." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "I'm done. Mortgage, car credit cards, no more." Her jaw dropped. "Melanie, be serious." "I am." She laughed, but it came out hollow. "Why would you do that? After everything we've done for you?" I stared at her. "What exactly have you done for me?" "We raised you, put food on the table, the bare minimum, Mom." My voice stayed calm, but my fingers curled into fists. "When Eli was born, who came to help? Not you. When James left me, you didn't even check in. When Eli was in the hospital with pneumonia, you went to Sarah's lake house instead. She looked like I'd slapped her, but I wasn't done. You weren't there when I needed you. Leah and Brian were. My ex's family treats Eli like he matters. You treat him like a chore. Mel, that's not fair. You skipped his birthday for Sarah's beach trip. I had emergency surgery 3 weeks ago, and you wouldn't pick him up because Sarah had a dinner reservation." Mom opened her mouth. I cut her off. "You called him a burden, Mom." Her face paled. The words had landed. The hallway creaked, and Dad appeared again. "What's all this yelling about?" "She's cutting us off," Mom snapped. "After all we've done for her, is this about that dinner?" Dad frowned. "We explained why we couldn't leave. It's not just about that. It's everything. Eli calls Leah Grandma now. Because she shows up." Dad scoffed. "You're being dramatic." "No, I'm being done." There it was. The line I'd never thought I'd say. It felt heavy, but it felt right. Dad rubbed his temples. "So what? You're just going to abandon your family?" "No," I said. "You did that years ago. I just finally stopped pretending otherwise." Silence fell. Even the fridge hum seemed louder. Mom's voice dropped. "Your father's prescription is due. The car payment, the insurance. I've handled it all for years. You can figure it out now. Sarah's salary should help." Right on cue, the front door opened. "I brought champagne." Sarah's voice was sunny as ever. She stepped into the hallway, eyebrows lifting when she saw me. Mel, didn't know you were coming to my party. I wasn't. I picked up my purse. Just came to say goodbye. Her smile dimmed. Wait, what's going on? Ask Mom, I said, brushing past her. Wait, Melanie. Mom's voice cracked behind me. You can't just do this. But I could. And I was. I walked out of that house with shaking hands and a clearer heart than I'd had in years. That night, Leah sent a photo of Eli helping her bake cookies, his face dusted with flour, his grin wide and carefree. For the first time in a long time, I felt something settle in my chest. Not guilt, not grief, just peace. The morning after I walked out of my parents' house, everything felt quiet. Not peaceful, not yet, just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like the air's holding its breath. Like something big just happened, and the world's trying to decide how to react. Eli was still asleep, curled up under his dinosaur comforter. I sat in the kitchen, sipping lukewarm coffee. My phone flipped face down on the table like it might bite me if I looked. I wasn't expecting a text or an apology, but I'll be honest, I expected something. Instead, radio silence. No calls, no messages, not even a passive-aggressive emoji from Mom. By the third day, the silence turned into space, the kind I'd never realized I needed. I could breathe a little easier, think a little clearer. For once, I wasn't waiting for approval that was never coming. Still, detangling from them wasn't just emotional. It was financial. Messy, slow, and full of weight. You're canceling what? Phone calls. I spent hours closing out the joint credit card I'd co-signed for them years ago. The one they swore they'd only use for emergencies, but had somehow racked up charges from online shopping sprees and hotel stays I'd never been invited to. Then came the car loan. I'd been covering it through autopay so long, I barely remembered it wasn't mine. And the mortgage don't even get me started. I didn't even live there anymore, hadn't in over a decade. But guess whose name was still tied to it? Mine. Because it's just easier this way, Mom had said once, smiling while I signed papers. Easier for them, not for me. I called the bank and made it official. I removed myself from everything. Let them figure it out. Let Sarah help, if she wanted to. She'd always been their golden ticket anyway. And then, just like that, I was free. Well, mostly. One night, about 2 weeks later, Eli sat at the dining table with a stack of colored pencils and a construction paper family tree. His second grade assignment. Simple enough. Except nothing in our life had ever really been simple. Need help, bud? I asked, leaning over his shoulder. He nodded, tongue poking out as he concentrated. I got Grandma Leah and Grandpa Brian at the top. You go under them. I paused. Not. Grandma Trish and Grandpa Carl? He didn't even look up. No. I put them on the back, but they're crossed out. I blinked. You crossed them out? Yeah, 'cause they don't like me. I crouched next to him. Who told you that? No one. I just know. They don't come to my soccer games, or my birthdays, or when I was sick and threw up in the car. Remember? Leah came. I did remember. Too well. His little hand slid into mine. Can I keep it like this? I smiled, heart cracking a little. You can do whatever feels right to you. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, glass of wine in hand, wondering when I had become the kind of person who needed permission to choose herself, who gave and gave, hoping one day it'd be enough. And, the worst part, I didn't even blame my parents entirely. They were just repeating what they'd learned. Love is currency. Affection with strings attached. Obligation dressed up as family duty. It was a cycle, and I had spent my whole life thinking if I just worked harder, if I just gave a little more, I'd finally win. But cycles don't break themselves. Someone has to say no first. A week after the cutoff, Sarah texted. Not a call, just this. Mom says you're punishing them. Can we talk? I stared at my screen for a while before typing back. Sure, tomorrow. Coffee? We met at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory. She was already there when I walked in, stirring tea like she had a grudge against the spoon. Her blouse was crisp, hair perfectly curled, always polished, always on point. Thanks for coming, she said flatly. I sat across from her. You said you wanted to talk. She didn't waste time. They're not doing well, Mel, I figured. Mortgage is behind. Dad's blood pressure meds are expensive. You just cut everything. No warning. I held back a laugh. There was warning, Sarah. Years of it. You think this is revenge? think this is finally me choosing not to bleed for people who wouldn't hand me a Band-Aid." She flinched a little. Good. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because for once she was listening. "They say you're overreacting. They said Eli was a burden, Sarah." Silence. Then, softly, "They didn't mean that. Maybe not. But they said it. And they acted like it. You know how many times he asked why they never come to his games? Why they never call him?" She looked away, guilt shadowing her face. I leaned in. "I'm not doing this to hurt them. I'm doing this because I've spent years giving them everything I had, emotionally, financially, and it was never enough. I'm not bitter. I'm tired." Sarah stirred her tea again, slower this time. "You've always been stronger than me," she said quietly. "They made me the favorite, but it never felt like a gift. It felt like a leash." I blinked. That I hadn't expected. She looked up at me. "I'm not asking you to go back. I just wanted to understand. And now I do." We didn't hug. We weren't there yet. But when we left the cafe, she touched my shoulder briefly. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, I told Eli, "We're gonna be okay." He looked up from his book and said, "I know, Mom." I smiled. That was all I needed to hear. 3 weeks had passed since that conversation with Sarah. No calls from my parents, no texts, no surprise visits. Silence stretched between us like a canyon, deep, wide, echoing with everything unsaid. And honestly, it was peaceful. Not perfect, but quiet, in a way I hadn't known I needed. I'd started sleeping through the night again. I was cooking real meals, not just microwave dinners eaten over a sink. Eli had started humming while brushing his teeth, like the heaviness in the air had lifted and he could breathe easier too. Then, on a completely average Tuesday laundry in the dryer, soup simmering on the stove, my phone buzzed. "Mom." I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the red button. But something in me didn't swipe it away. "Not this time," I answered. "Melanie." Her voice was flat, practiced. "We need to talk. Not how are you. Not how's Eli. Just a need. A request wrapped in control." "What about?" I asked. There was a pause. "We're struggling. Your father's medication hasn't been filled. The car's in the shop. We're behind on the mortgage." I didn't respond. "Sarah says it's time you came home, talked face to face. We're still your family." That word, family. They used it like a spell, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "I have to go," I said calmly. "Eli has a project due." "Melanie," she started, but I ended the call. That night, I found Eli on the floor of his room building a fort out of couch cushions and old cardboard boxes. He looked up and beamed. "Want to come inside? There's snacks." There were 3 crackers and a juice box. I crawled in anyway. He leaned his head against my arm. "Can we go to Leah's this weekend?" she said. "Grandpa Brian's grilling burgers." "Of course," I smiled. That weekend came like a balm. Leah's backyard was filled with laughter and that easy kind of chaos you only get with family who want to be there. Eli played catch with Brian while Leah and I prepped the potato salad. At one point, I just stood there, watching them, Eli running barefoot across the grass. His laugh sharp and full, and I felt it again. That peace, that deep, grounded peace that comes not from absence, but from presence, from choosing who gets to matter in your life. Leah handed me a soda and nudged my arm. "You doing okay?" "Actually," I said. "Yeah, I think I am." She nodded like she already knew. "Good. You deserve this." I don't know what it was, maybe the warmth of the sun. Maybe the way Eli kept calling Brian Gramps with this grin on his face, but in that moment, I finally stopped asking myself if I'd done the right thing. I had. But peace doesn't mean closure. That came the following week when I got a letter. Not a text, not an email, a letter. In my father's handwriting, neat, all caps, no greeting. "We are officially 2 months behind on the mortgage. The bank has called multiple times. We cannot access the credit accounts you closed. We expect some responsibility from you as our daughter." I laughed when I finished reading it, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. So, them. Not "we're sorry," not "we understand," just "we expect." I tucked the letter in a drawer and went about my day. The next morning, Sarah called. I told them I wasn't covering for them. She said, "No hello, no preamble. They're upset." "Let them be," I replied, pouring myself coffee. She was quiet for a beat. Then, "They always thought you'd never say no. They were right. Until now. They're probably going to lose the house." I didn't say anything. "They're blaming you." Of course they were. Sarah, I said, setting my cup down. You know what's wild? I've spent most of my adult life bailing them out. Not once did they say thank you. But the second I stop, I'm the villain. I'm not defending them, she replied. But I think they genuinely don't know how to exist without someone cushioning their consequences. That's not my fault. No, she agreed. It's not. That call ended differently than I expected, with her thanking me. Not for the money, for the clarity. You showed me what a boundary looks like, she said. It's terrifying, but I think I needed to see it. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, because she wasn't wrong. It was terrifying, drawing lines, not with strangers, but with people who helped shape you, who fed you, clothed you, and at the same time made you feel invisible. But I had learned something through it all. Love isn't meant to feel like debt. A week later, I got another message, this time from a number I didn't recognize. Hey, it's Dave. Your dad asked me to appraise the house for possible sale. Just looping you in since your name's still technically on the title. My stomach dropped. Somehow, after everything, my name was still attached. That night, I dug through old emails, scanned paperwork, called the bank. The signature was there, mine, from 10 years ago. I'd co-signed during one of Dad's "it'll just be temporary" spiels. I'd forgotten. I was drowning in diapers and divorce back then. I'd signed a lot of things just to keep the peace. Now, that peace was haunting me. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse, filed the paperwork, paid the fees, made it official. The house was theirs, fully and legally. No more strings, no more leverage. When the confirmation email came, I sat at my desk and exhaled so hard I nearly cried. It was done. Completely, finally, done. I looked around my small but cozy apartment, the mismatched mugs, Eli's artwork taped to the fridge, the secondhand bookshelf overflowing with too many stories. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Paid for, loved, lived in. That night, Eli climbed onto the couch beside me. Can we read the Rocket book again? I pulled him close, kissed his forehead, and opened the book. Of course, buddy. As many times as you want. Because this was the life I'd fought for. Not big, not loud, but free. Spring crept in slowly. Soft winds carried the smell of rain, and tiny green buds appeared on trees like shy secrets. Eli had started riding his bike again, insisting he didn't need training wheels anymore, which made me both proud and deeply anxious. We'd fallen into a rhythm, just the two of us. I didn't realize how heavy the past had been until I stopped carrying it. Every day felt a little lighter, like I was finally living, not just reacting. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back. That is, until I got a letter from my father's attorney. It was typed, formal. This notice is to inform you that Carl Brennan has designated you as executor in his revised estate plan, effective immediately. I stopped reading. Executor? The man who hadn't spoken to me in over a month, who once said raising me was the responsible thing to do, wanted me to manage his affairs? I tossed the letter on the counter and laughed, sharp, bitter, unexpected. It wasn't even anger this time, just disbelief. Eli wandered in, hair tousled, holding a bowl of dry cereal. What's funny? Nothing, sweetheart, I said, pulling him into a side hug. Just another grown-up being confusing. He shrugged, already focused on his next Lego masterpiece. But that letter stuck in my head all day, buzzing like a mosquito I couldn't swat away. I called the law office. A woman answered, pleasant but rehearsed. She confirmed the documents, confirmed the role, confirmed that yes, they had spoken to my father. He'd insisted on naming me. I almost asked why, but I already knew the answer. Control. Even in distance, he was still trying to tether me back to them. A few nights later, Sarah called again. He's in the hospital, she said. No greeting. Just the facts. Chest pains. They're keeping him overnight for observation. I didn't reply right away. I'm not asking you to come, she added. I just thought you should know. I stayed silent, waiting to hear what wasn't being said. She exhaled. Mom's a mess. They've gone through most of their savings. I think Dad thought, I don't know, that if things got bad, you'd step in again. I swallowed the ache rising in my throat. You know I can't. I know, she said, and this time, she meant it. After we hung up, I sat on the floor of my bedroom for a long while, not crying, not angry, just processing. Grief is strange. It shows up even when you're not sure what you're grieving. Not the man himself, maybe, but the idea of him, the version I'd once hoped he'd become. A few days passed. No update, no emergency, no sudden call begging me to return. Then a message from Sarah. He's home. He's different. Not better, just quieter. He asked if Eli remembers him. I didn't respond, because the truth was, he didn't. Not really. Eli remembered birthdays spent with Leah, field trips where Brian volunteered, sick days when they brought soup. But my parents? They were blurry. Background noise. Names on a holiday card, if that. A week later, a package arrived at my door. No return address. Inside, a small wooden box. I opened it slowly, unsure what I'd find. Letters. Dozens of them, all written in my father's handwriting. Unsent. Unfinished. Some addressed to me. Some to Eli. One caught my eye creased, stained like it had been read too many times. Melanie, I don't know how to be close to people. I didn't learn it from my parents, and I didn't try hard enough to unlearn it. You were always good at things I didn't understand, saying what you felt, making space for other people's pain. I wasn't equipped for that. I saw your strength and thought it made me weak. I was wrong. I read it twice, then 3 times, and I cried not because it made things okay, but because it didn't. It was too late, a lifetime too late, but still, it was something, an admission, a beginning that would never find its middle. That night, I sat Eli down. There's something I want to show you, I said, pulling out the box. He opened it carefully, pulling out a letter with his name on it in scratchy cursive. He didn't ask why his grandfather wrote him a letter instead of just talking to him. He just read, his lips moving silently. When he finished, he looked up. He says he wished he came to more of my games. I know. He says he didn't know how to show love. I nodded. Does that mean he didn't love me? No, I said, brushing his hair back gently. It means he didn't know how to show it. That's not your fault, and it wasn't your job to fix. He leaned into me, small and warm and wise in ways he didn't understand yet. Do I have to forgive him? I shook my head. You don't have to do anything. You just get to feel whatever's real. He nodded and whispered, Okay. That night, I lit a candle on the windowsill and sat beside it. Not for mourning, not for memory, for release. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about choosing not to carry it anymore. The next morning, I called the attorney. I declined the role, I said, voice steady. I won't be the executor. She paused. Understood. May I ask why? Because I've already spent enough of my life managing things that weren't mine to carry. She didn't argue. She just made a note and wished me well. And for once, I believed someone meant it. Later that day, I found Eli in the backyard, tying a string around a paper airplane. What's that for? I asked. It's a wish, he said. I want it to fly far away and let go of the heavy stuff. I watched him launch it into the sky. The paper wobbled, danced, then caught a breeze and drifted high above the rooftops. We stood in silence, heads tilted up. Do you think it worked? He asked. I think, I said. You just taught me how to let go. Summer rolled in without asking for permission. The days grew longer, the air heavier, and our little apartment buzzed with the kind of quiet joy that feels almost sacred. Not loud, not dramatic, just soft and real. Eli had started sleeping with his window cracked open, letting in the night breeze. He'd grown taller, quieter too, in some ways, but more certain, more sure of his place in the world. And I think I was starting to feel that way too. I'd always assumed healing would feel like a wave, sudden, sweeping, powerful. But instead, it was more like moss growing between stones, slow, patient, quiet. I stopped checking my phone for messages that weren't coming. I stopped expecting closure from people who didn't have the language for it. The silence from my parents had stretched into months now. I hadn't blocked them, but I hadn't reached out either. And I didn't feel guilty. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer full of old mail, I found the last birthday card they'd sent Eli. It wasn't signed, just, "Happy birthday. Hope you enjoy the gift card." Mom and Dad, no message. No note, no hint of anything personal. I tucked it back where I found it and let it go. Later that week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Melanie Brennan?" a woman asked. "Yes, this is Dana from Pacific Financial. I'm not sure if you remember me, but we met at the Chamber of Commerce event last fall. I work in community outreach nonprofit investments. We're launching a mentorship program, and your name came up. I blinked, trying to place her voice. She continued, we're looking for women in finance who've overcome, well, let's say, unconventional journeys, single parents, career pivots, personal challenges. You came highly recommended. I leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly more alert. What would that involve? Mentoring younger women entering the field, speaking at 2 events a year, occasional consulting. We offer compensation, but it's modest. This is more about impact. Impact. That word sat with me. Not approval, not obligation. Impact. I'm interested, I said, and meant it. That evening, I told Eli over dinner. He was too busy blowing bubbles into his chocolate milk to care about career details, but he smiled anyway. Will you still pick me up from school? Always, I said. That part doesn't change. The truth was, everything was changing, but it felt natural now, not forced. The next weekend, Leah hosted a small barbecue. Just a few friends, neighbors, and the usual chaos of kids playing tag across the lawn. Eli and Brian built a birdhouse together. Leah handed me a glass of iced tea and asked how work was going. It's good, I said, but I think I want to do more. I don't want to just make money. I want to use what I've learned. She grinned. You're talking like a woman who's finally not just surviving. I laughed. Maybe I am. After the cookout, I helped her clean up. We stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, and I realized something strange. I hadn't thought about my parents in days, not even once. It wasn't that I didn't care. It was that their absence no longer felt like a wound. It felt like space, and I was finally filling it with something better. Later that night, I opened my laptop and started working on the presentation for the mentorship program. The prompt was simple: tell your story. At first, I stared at the blinking cursor. Where would I even begin? Eventually, I typed, one didn't grow up in a family where love was spoken freely. I learned early on that approval had a price, and affection came with conditions. I spent years trying to earn something that should have been freely given. The words flowed faster than I expected. I became a mother in the middle of a crumbling marriage. I built a career while bottle feeding and chasing overdue bills. I lost people I thought were permanent and gained people I never saw coming. I paused, thought of Leah, Brian, even Sarah, who had started texting more lately, small things. A new plant she bought, a podcast episode she liked. No pressure, just presence. I used to think strength was about never falling apart. Now I know it's about choosing to rise anyway. I sat back and exhaled. That was enough for now. Before bed, Eli pulled out his school folder. Family Day is next month, he said. You're supposed to send in a photo of our family. I raised an eyebrow. And who counts as family? He grinned. You, me, Leah, Grandpa Brian, Aunt Sarah, if she brings cookies. I laughed. That's fair. He paused. Not Grandma Trish and Grandpa Carl? I shook my head. Not unless you want them there. He thought for a moment. I don't. I like the people who show up. That simple, that clear, that true. I printed a photo we'd taken at the cookout, Eli holding a sparkler, me mid-laugh, Leah behind us with her hand on his shoulder. No fancy poses, just joy. The next day, he packed it carefully in his backpack, and that was that. No debate, no sadness, just a quiet confirmation that we were okay. A few mornings later, I got another letter. No return address. Familiar handwriting. This time, it was from my mom. It read, I don't know how to fix what's broken. I'm not asking for money. I just want to know if there's a way back. I miss my grandson. I miss you, even if I don't say it well. Trish, no manipulation. No guilt, just rawness. For the first time, she left space for me to decide. I stared at it for a long time, not angry, not hopeful either, just weighing it. I didn't respond right away. I folded the letter and set it aside. Later that night, I stood outside, barefoot on the porch, watching stars blink into the sky. I didn't know what I would do yet. I didn't owe anyone an answer. What I did know was this: I wasn't lost anymore. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen myself, and that was more than enough. Some endings don't arrive all at once. They show up slowly, like the last light of day slipping through your window. You don't notice the shift until you realize the room has gone dark and you feel calm. That's how it felt in the weeks after my mother's letter. I didn't rush to answer. I didn't tear it up either. I just let it sit on the counter, unread again and again, until one night I found myself holding it like it might tell me something new the 10th time around. It didn't, but it also didn't demand anything. That was new. The truth is, I didn't know what to say. I wasn't angry anymore, not the kind that simmers and burns, but I wasn't ready to open the door either. What she wanted might not exist anymore. Some relationships don't get rebuilt. They just settle into something quieter. Not hate, not warmth, just distance and a little grace. A few days later, I sent her a short note. I got your letter. Thank you for writing. Eli's doing well. I don't know what the future holds, but I hope you're taking care of yourself, Melanie. It wasn't cold. It wasn't an invitation either. It was real. And for me, that was enough. After that, I didn't hear back. No response. No second attempt. Just silence again, but this time it didn't sting. It felt right-sized, like life had finally settled into the shape it was meant to be. Fall came early that year. The air crisped up fast, and leaves littered our porch like nature's confetti. Eli started 3rd grade with a new backpack, 2 missing teeth, and a renewed obsession with planets. He asked for a telescope for his birthday, and I found a second-hand one online that still worked like a dream. Every night, he dragged it to the balcony, pointing it toward the sky. I think that one's Jupiter, he'd say. Sometimes he was right, sometimes not. Didn't matter. He believed in what he saw. That was enough. One Saturday, while he and Brian built a fire pit in the backyard, I drove to a local college for my first guest lecture. The mentorship program had taken off faster than expected. I was now leading workshops on financial literacy for women leaving tough situations, divorces, layoffs, single motherhood. I stood in front of a classroom full of women who reminded me of myself at 25, tired, unsure, determined. And I told them what I wish someone had told me back then. You don't have to have it all together to start over. You just have to stop handing your power to people who don't know what to do with it. Heads nodded. Some took notes. One woman cried quietly in the back. Not loud tears, just release. After the session, she came up to me. "Thank you," she said. "You made me feel like maybe I'm not broken, just unfinished." I smiled. "You're not broken. You're just growing." That night, I told Eli about it over tacos. "You teach grown-ups?" he asked, clearly horrified. "That sounds scary." "It is sometimes," I laughed, "but it's worth it." He thought about that, like when I was scared to ride my bike without training wheels. Exactly. Do you think Grandma Trish is still scared of being different? That question came out of nowhere, but it didn't surprise me. I think some people get scared and stay stuck there, I said carefully. Even if they don't mean to. He nodded slowly. I hope she learns how to be different. Me too, kid. Me too. The seasons kept turning. Thanksgiving came, quiet and warm. Leah made sweet potatoes with way too many marshmallows. Brian grilled the turkey again. He insisted it was better than roasting. And honestly, he was right. We sat around their table with neighbors and friends who had become family. No big speeches, just laughter, clinking glasses, and Eli asking for seconds like he'd never eaten before. I looked around and realized something simple, something profound. I had everything I needed, not in the way I once imagined it. No giant house, no picture-perfect holiday cards with all the right people. Just love. Chosen, earned, tended to, and that was more than enough. One night in December, I found a box while cleaning the closet. Old photos, some from college, some from my first apartment, a few baby pictures of Eli, swaddled and red-faced and brand new. And then one photo I hadn't seen in years, me maybe 10, standing on the front steps of my parents' old house, holding a spelling bee ribbon. I looked proud, hopeful. My mom stood behind me, distracted, adjusting Sarah's dress for her piano recital. I stared at that little girl for a long time. Then I whispered, "You were always enough. You just didn't know it." I tucked the photo back into the box, but not before sliding a note in beside it. We made it. That was for her, for me, for every version of me that ever wondered if I was asking too much by wanting to be seen. Christmas came. Eli got his telescope cleaned and mounted properly. Leah gave me a journal, simple and leather-bound. Inside the front cover, she'd written, "For all the things you let go, for all the things you're about to grow, The first page stayed blank for a while. Then, one evening, I sat on the porch, pen in hand, and wrote, "Family isn't about matching DNA. It's about the people who stay, who show up, who make space for your voice, not just your presence." And that was where I chose to begin, not with what I'd lost, but with what I'd found. Story 2, Matthew, we sold your flat. With pride, my mother made the announcement, "We now own it." In front of the entire family, she grinned. I watched in silence as they were detained outside my building. A day later, I'm Matthew, and I'm 30 years old. I have always believed that success comes from hard work. It must be correct. If not, why would anyone spend years working nonstop, foregoing sleep, persevering through fatigue, and making prudent financial decisions while others are having a good time? This conviction got me through college, the difficult years of working many jobs to make ends meet, and eventually to the point where I could finally exhibit my hard work with something tangible, a home of my own. For the very first time, I wasn't surviving off of salary after paycheck. Rent was not a regular source of concern for me. I wasn't anxiously looking at my bank account to make sure I had enough money to pay for everything. My house was evidence of my tenacity. It wasn't a dilapidated apartment in a seedy area or a little studio. It was a chic, modern apartment in a desirable area. Something I saved all of my money for, worked hard for, and paid for with my own money. No money was borrowed, no outside help. Only myself and years of unrelenting work are now paying off. My parents, however, saw things very differently. During my early years, I was always the independent one, the child who never demanded handouts, rarely asked for anything, and solved problems on their own. Joshua, my younger sibling, was quite the opposite. He was the favorite, the golden kid. In their perspective, the one who could do no wrong. He was lavished with attention by my parents, gave him everything without question, and was always coming up with reasons to blame for his shortcomings. It didn't matter if he made bad decisions in life, squandered money recklessly, or failed his tests. There was always a reason why he wasn't at fault. In the meantime, I was always supposed to be the trustworthy one. I was supposed to give Joshua money if he needed it. If Joshua ended up in trouble, I was supposed to assist him. If Joshua made poor choices, I was meant to be the older sibling who made the necessary repairs. It was exhausting. No matter how much I accomplished, Joshua was always the focus. I eventually stopped attempting to refute it. I knew how it operated. When Joshua wanted something, he got it. Even if I had to pay for it, I have to put in the effort to achieve my goals. That was just the way it was, and I took it for granted for a very long time. I promised myself that I wouldn't have to deal with it when I moved out and started my own life. I was wrong. I was given an amazing opportunity a few weeks ago, a business trip abroad that would enable me to connect with some of the most influential people in my field. It was more than simply an important event. It was the kind of chance that may change my professional trajectory entirely. I accepted, of course. After packing my things and boarding the plane, I worked harder than ever for the next month. I didn't realize there were missed calls till I got back, dozens of them. Before I could really comprehend what was occurring, my father, mother, and even Joshua had made many attempts to get in touch with me. My phone rang again. My mom was the one. There was an odd feeling. This was the most persistent attempt my parents had ever made to get in touch with me. After a moment of hesitation, I picked up Matthew. She gave a warm greeting in an unusually upbeat tone. "You've returned." My brows wrinkled. "Yes, I just touched down. What's happening?" "Oh, nothing," she replied. Her speech was hurried. "All we wanted to do was check in. How did your journey go?" "It was all okay," I answered warily. She sounded like she was barely holding back, and I'm still trying to understand why. Laughter. "What made you call so frequently?" "Just long enough to make me feel uneasy." There was a brief silence. "Well," she said, extending the word at last. "We have some wonderful news." I said nothing. I knew in my heart that I would not like what she was going to say. "Your apartment was sold." When she finally made the announcement, her voice briefly burst with excitement. I believed I misheard her. "What did you do?" I asked in an emotionless tone. "We made a sale." "As if it didn't matter," she repeated. "In any case, wasn't it such a hassle? Property taxes and maintenance are constant concerns." "What a burden. But don't worry. For it, we received a fantastic bargain. My hands gripped my phone more tightly as my mind raced, trying to process what I had just heard. "You had absolutely no right," I said, enunciating each word slowly, keeping my voice as composed as possible despite the anger boiling inside me. "Oh, come on, Matthew," she replied dismissively, as though I were being unreasonable. "Joshua required a vehicle. You understand how difficult it has been for him without one. How else is he supposed to travel? He has responsibilities, places he must go." It felt like I had stepped into a nightmare. "You got rid of my apartment just to purchase Joshua a car. Not just any car." My mother corrected, "A high-end sports car. He deserves something extravagant." I was too stunned to respond. My mother interpreted my silence as encouragement to keep talking. "You should have seen his reaction," she gushed. "He was thrilled. He even said, 'Wow, I can't believe Matthew finally did something worthwhile.'" A dry, humorless chuckle left my lips. "You're kidding." She laughed as well, but this was no joke. "Isn't that adorable?" I shut my eyes, inhaling deeply to stop myself from saying something I would regret. "You do understand," I said evenly, "that you never had the legal authority to sell my apartment." Quiet. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to tell me that for the first time, my mother was unsure. "What are you discussing?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharper, though she couldn't see it. I smirked. I stated calmly that the apartment was never yours to sell." Her laughter had vanished completely. "Matthew," she said, unease creeping into her tone. "What do you mean?" I checked my watch. "You'll find out soon enough." I ended the call. For a moment I sat still, gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I wanted to shout, to break something, to demand an explanation that would make this insanity reasonable. But I already knew there wasn't one. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. My parents had waited until I was overseas, taken advantage of the fact that I was thousands of miles away, and without hesitation, they had sold my home like it was some useless item they no longer needed. And for what? A car for Joshua. Running a hand through my hair, I took a slow breath. This was beyond entitlement. This was theft. And the worst part? They truly believed I would accept it, shrug my shoulders, and move on. Not now. I scrolled through my contact list and called my real estate agent. After 2 rings, she answered. "Matthew, I was just going to contact you," she said, somewhat breathless. I frowned. "Why?" A brief pause. "You haven't checked your emails." Pulling the phone away from my ear, I opened my inbox. Over a dozen emails from the real estate agency. Some automatic, some personally from my agent. All tagged urgent. My stomach grew constricted. "I've been out of the country," I said cautiously. "What took place?" "Your parents arrived last week with a buyer," she stated. "They claimed you had granted them complete legal permission to sell the property." Every muscle in my body clenched. "They did what they insisted. You had signed over rights before departing," she added, carefully picking her words. "At first, the documents were real, but when I sought to check them, the signatures didn't match historical records." I began looking into it at that point. A chilly serenity descended upon me. "What did you discover?" She paused. "Matthew, your signature was falsified." I closed my eyes and let out a slow breath. She hurriedly continued. "I wanted to get in touch sooner, but they said you were in a remote area without service. I waited to complete the deal until I could get confirmation from you, since I had a suspicion something wasn't right. However, the buyer persisted, claiming that your parents had given him the assurance that everything was lawful." "Did the sale go through?" I swallowed. "No," she firmly stated. "They were getting hostile, but I stalled as long as I could. If I still couldn't get through to you, I was going to report it tomorrow." I let out a long breath. They had not succeeded. They thought they were successful. They were most likely celebrating right now, certain that they had executed the ideal trick. However, they were unaware of what was about to occur next. I looked at my timepiece. Even though it was late, I didn't care. "In an hour, is it possible for us to meet in your office?" I asked. "Of course." Without hesitation, she answered and hung up. I reclined in my chair and gazed up at the ceiling. They had almost committed fraud under my identity, deceived a customer, and forged my signature. However, they were unaware that their scheme had failed. A dark, sluggish smile came across my face. By the time I got back to town, this was going to become interesting. I had thought of a plan. There wouldn't be any yelling or conflict. I would just let them fall into their own trap. I had a meeting with my real estate agent the next morning. She had already gathered all of the falsified paperwork and thorough notes on the pressure my parents had put on her and the prospective buyer. There was no denying the evidence, she remarked, slipping a document over the desk. They're panicking. Your parents reassured the buyer that everything was in order, but he was still nervous. They even said they had taken over the transaction since you were psychologically incapable of managing your own money. I shook my head and sneered, incredibly so. I also consulted a lawyer, she said, lowering her voice. In addition to being dishonest, what they did was against the law. They may have been charged with identity theft and fraud if they had been successful. My smile remained unwavering. They may still do so. I then headed to the police station. Even though I had no idea how this would turn out, I wouldn't allow them get away with it. I told an officer everything and gave him the proof when we sat down. He scowled as he turned the pages of the papers. This is a severe matter. It is illegal to falsify a signature on official documents, particularly when doing so to sell real estate. That's what I thought. I gave a balanced response. He gave a nod. We'll have to interrogate them in person. Excellent. I didn't tell my folks. There was no warning from me. I just waited. It took very little time. My phone rang that evening. As soon as I replied, my mother's anxious voice screamed, "What have you done, Matthew?" I grinned in response. "What are you saying?" The cops were present. They charged us with deception. This is ridiculous. Your folks are where? How could you harm us like this? Mom, I didn't do anything, I murmured, leaning back in my seat. Did you do this to yourself? Anger made her voice waver. You were reared by us. You need to be appreciative of all that we have done. Are you aware of the trouble we're in? Yes, I do. I responded with ease. You nearly duped a buyer, lied to a real estate company, and falsified my signature. Mom, that's more than simply difficulty. It is illegal to do so. She gave a quick breath. Joshua was the recipient. Matthew, that automobile was necessary for him. Everything is yours. He, too. Everything the first own is something I earned. Coldly, I cut in. You also attempted to take it away from me. Quiet. Then she said, "What's going to happen to us?" In a much softer tone. I pondered the question. You'll find out, I suppose. Before hanging up, I said, the weeks that followed were chaotic. Officially, my parents were accused of forgery and attempted fraud. They were hit with hefty fines and legal costs even though they were spared jail time. Enraged by the deceit, the buyer was thinking of suing them for wasting his time. Joshua was furious, of course. Everything was damaged by you. When we finally spoke, he lost his temper. You put my parents in trouble when they were only attempting to assist me. I gaped at him in shock. Are you really pointing the finger at me? Yes, he yelled. You have the option to ignore it. It's not as though you lack funds. You may have purchased a different location. In fact, I laughed. Joshua, that's not the problem. They attempted to rob me. My signature was falsified. You're upset with me too? You're self-centered. He spat. You were and always were. I shook my head. I let out a sigh. Joshua, no. I simply don't allow myself to be exploited. Their plan ultimately cost them much more than they had anticipated. They lost their reputation. Their so-called golden child was suddenly no longer so special after friends. An extended family found out. My apartment was still mine, and I at last realized how little my family actually appreciated me. However, my anger had subsided. The most important thing was that I was free. They had the option to steal. I wish I could say my parents shamed me and punished me legally for coming to that decision, realized their mistake at last, and proceeded. That Joshua, my so-called brother, took a moment to acknowledge how completely absurd his entitlement had become. Naturally, however, such was not the case. Rather, they became more aggressive. Attempts to manipulate emotions were the first step. My mom began making strange phone calls. She spoke in an overly distressed tone. How you could do this to us, Matthew, is beyond me. One night, she let out a whimper. Even going to work makes your father feel embarrassed. Everyone is talking about it. Maybe you ought to have thought about it before committing fraud. I gave a bland response. She gasped suddenly, like though I had struck her. You have no heart at all. Your family is us. Families are meant to pardon you. I'm referring to how you discreetly sold my house. I retorted. Then there was silence. "One day, you'll regret this," she said, in a strangled, hardly audible voice. She then hung up the telephone, and it was only the beginning. The justifications followed. Joshua determined that the best course of action was to warp reality, evidently encouraged by the fact that he had not been held accountable for his role. "You exaggerated everything," he sneered. "When I happened to run into him at a family event that I had never intended to go to in the first place. Both parents made a mistake. Yes. However, did they truly merit all of this?" I looked at him in disbelief. "Joshua, they were dishonest. It was for me, though." As if it in some way explained everything, he said. I took a deep breath and remained calm. "And you don't think that's problematic?" He gave an eye roll. "You're rich. It's not as if you spent the most of your time there. Why do you think this is such a huge deal?" And there it was, the source of the problem. Joshua believed that my achievement was never really mine, thus he didn't see anything wrong with their behavior. He thought he was entitled to anything I had just because we were related, regardless of how hard I worked or how much I achieved. I at last realized something at that point. This continued. Not until I was positive it did. A few weeks later, the last straw was reached. I was at last at home, enjoying the tranquility that comes with removing them from my life. When my phone displayed an unknown number, I said hi against my better judgment. Through the telephone came a voice I recognized instantly. The speaker drooled, "Mr. Bryan." I scowled. "Who is this?" A low laugh. "Oh, I think we've already spoken. I was considering purchasing your prior property." My whole body stiffened. This man was the one to whom my parents had almost sold my house. Had no business getting in touch with me. "What are you looking for?" I inquired about my tone. "It's freezing now. I must admit that I was rather dissatisfied with the way things worked out," he answered with ease. I was assured of a great bargain and a premium property in a tidy bundle. "But regrettably, you got in the way." I gripped the phone more tightly. I said, "Get to the point." The man let out a sigh. "Your beloved parents still appear to be in a state of desperation. They contacted me once more to ask whether I would still be interested in buying the home from you at a reduced price. A covert agreement, if you will." My stomach turned over. The attempt to sell my apartment was still ongoing. I was momentarily unable to speak. Then I made myself talk slowly. "And what was your reaction?" One more low laugh. "Yes, I did tell them I would think about it. However, I don't like being duped, Mr. Bryan. When they originally vowed to have complete control over the transaction, I already know they can't bargain on your behalf, but now they're acting like they can. It's not professional either." I was enraged. They knew nothing. They had no regrets. All they were doing was looking for a different approach to influence events to their advantage. "I have a straightforward query," the guy went on, his tone piercing. "Did you know about this small plot?" I let out a steady sigh, controlling my anger. "I think it's time someone teaches your family a lesson," he said, adding, "I am good now." I leaned a little. "What precisely do you propose?" He laughed quietly and ominously. "Oh, this is something you'll like, I believe." I realized then that there was still much to be resolved in this matter. I stood in my living room as the phone ended, my heart thumping with a mixture of anger and determination. I'd always thought of myself as the cool one, the one who used a level-headed attitude to both personal and professional concerns. However, my parents' actions and their ongoing attempts had gone beyond what I could stand. They no longer viewed me as a unique person, but rather as a barrier to get beyond and a tool they could use to forward their own agenda. Without spending any more time, I was done letting them get away with it. I acted right away. To make sure everything was legally sound, I started by getting in touch with my lawyer. Even though I had previously informed the police about the incident, I was aware that my parents may escape responsibility if I didn't take immediate action. An important turning point had been the buyer's call. Now it was time to retaliate. I then contacted the real estate company that had first dealt with the bogus effort to sell. I went into great depth to clarify everything. What she heard left the involved agent speechless. She listened to my story and decided to testify against my parents right away. Her words would be tangible evidence that the whole plan had been meticulously planned. However, even that was insufficient. To make sure my parents couldn't use coercion to get out of this situation, I had to go one step further. I looked at the newspaper. This was no longer only a private dispute. By trying to sell a home that wasn't theirs at this point, my parents had openly committed fraud. Money wasn't the only factor. Justice was at issue. I wouldn't allow them get away with it. The media reacted quickly. Their names appeared in national headlines within days. Everyone was able to perceive their deceit, claiming that it was all a misunderstanding and that she had only done it out of love for Joshua. My mother hurried to repair the damage. However, it was already too late. They were already on the verge of collapse. The buyer is now completely involved with law enforcement. I decided to file charges once my lawyer and the authorities got in touch. My parents were taken into custody. The official conviction of my mother for faking my signature, however, was the true shock. She had gone to tremendous measures to control me, and now she was not only in danger of legal action, but also seeing her carefully cultivated public persona fall apart. Joshua was furious, of course. He was standing with our parents in the midst of a group of reporters when I got to the courthouse for one of the sessions. His hateful look was centered on me. "All of this is due to you," he spit. "Everything was damaged by you. You have the option to ignore it." Unsurprised by his irrational feeling of entitlement, I shook my head. "Give it up. Please pardon them for attempting to defraud me and for considering me as a cog in their wheel." "Joshua, no. This was bound to happen." His face grew serious. He balled his fists. "This is something you'll regret. People are always pushed away by you. You'll regret not having relatives one day." I remained silent. There was no reason to. I was already letting go. My parents had to deal with the consequences of their actions: heavy fines, probation, and the permanent stain of a criminal record as a result of the court fights that raged over the next months. Even though it was hard to stomach at every stage of the process, I'm not going to give up. The flat and the money loss were never the only factors in this. It has to do with their total indifference to me personally. They were sure I wouldn't say anything, that just because I was their son, I would be obedient, but they had miscalculated me badly. My mother's attempt to alter the events was the most frustrating aspect. She made one last attempt to contact them after the court procedures were over, her voice brimming with desperation. "We get it now, Matthew. This has taught us something. Can't we just get on with it? We are related. Do you not want us to move on from this?" I waited for the stillness to lengthen before answering. "No, Mom," I answered calmly and firmly. "We won't be starting over. Not now." I then hung up the phone. I didn't talk to them again after that. They never accepted accountability or acknowledged their mistakes. However, they did get a lasting understanding of the cost of treachery. I did the same, pondering everything. I don't regret defending my position. I have no regrets. I no longer had to live with their expectations and be enslaved to them for years. I was never their golden kid, nor was I ever their pawn. I was unique, and I would never let them rule my life ever again. What do you think then, Reddit? Was I being overly dramatic? Should I have moved on and let it go? Or was this the only way to guarantee that they would be held accountable for their deeds? I would love to know what you think. Story 3. You're on your own now, Ryan. As she tossed my belongings outside, my mother spoke. "All right, I'll keep this in mind." As I closed the door, I muttered. They were broke 6 months later, and I wasn't answering. At the age of 18, I'm Ryan, and my parents consider me to be a complete failure. Not because I made a mistake. No past criminal activity, poor habits, or anything like. My decision to delay enrolling in college was my lone error. Rather, I wanted to concentrate on my freelancing work, which I had been doing since high school, and, to be honest, was going really well. Although I wasn't yet wealthy, I was earning enough money to keep myself afloat. I had steady employment, regular clientele, and above all, I truly liked it. However, my folks hated it. Without a degree, you won't succeed. At least twice a week, my mother would remind me, "Your future is being thrown away. Are you really under the impression that this small side gig would last a lifetime?" My father would respond to them. I was a careless kid who didn't want to deal with reality. I assured them that I had nothing against greater learning. I simply didn't want to jump right in. I would think twice about going to college if my business failed. I was counting on myself, though, for the time being. They disapproved. Eric, my older brother, was having financial difficulties at the same time. He was having trouble paying their rent, as was his wife, Karen. Karen had a taste for luxury, and Eric wasn't exactly the most responsible person. Despite my parents' continuous complaints, they had already taken out several loans from them. Every time they cashed in and turned up more money. Then one day I came home to my mother going through my stuff. "What are you doing?" I inquired. She didn't give me a sidelong glance. "We must speak right away." I had an uneasy feeling. My dad and Eric were already seated in the living room when she ushered me in. There was no sign of Karen, most likely occupied with her regular activities. My mother cleared her throat. "You know, Ryan, your brother and Karen have had a difficult time. At the moment, they require some stability." "All right," I just stared. My father sighed, as if I were being challenging. "The decision has been made for Eric and Karen to move in. They need somewhere to stay. And when we have extra space, it doesn't make sense for them to struggle." I blinked. "We? It'll be all right, Ryan," my mother said in her typical patronizing tone. "You're 18. A place to live can be found for you. You're making your own money, aren't you?" I was so stunned I couldn't even react right away. They were kicking me out, just like that. "But this is my room," I finally said. "I live here. You don't contribute anything." Ryan, Eric, cut in, arms crossed like he was the one being inconvenienced. "You don't pay rent. I'm struggling, and I actually have a family to take care of." I almost laughed. "Karen doesn't even work, and you keep blowing money on useless things. How is that my responsibility?" My mom shot me a sharp look. "Ryan, stop being selfish. You're not our priority anymore. Eric and Karen need this more than you do." Then, to drive the point home, she grabbed one of my duffel bags and tossed it toward the door. "Start packing," she said. I turned to my dad, just hoping he'd at least try to reason with her. But no, he simply nodded, like this was a completely rational decision. I could have argued. I could have pleaded. But something inside me just shifted. I stood up. All right. I packed my belongings, everything I could take, and went out. I didn't weep. I didn't even say goodbye. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, I'd repay the favor for a while. I remained at a friend's apartment and poured myself into work. 6 months passed and I didn't hear a single word from them. No calls, no texts, not even a passive, nasty Facebook post about how young people these days have no respect in their brains. I was out of sight, out of mind, and honestly, that was absolutely great with me. In those 6 months, my life shifted entirely. I moved from barely scraping by to generating more money than I ever expected at my age. The type of money that made me chuckle at the thought of ever needing to borrow from my parents or anybody else ever again. In the beginning, I was just doing freelance work, but then I became smarter. I started delegating chores, developed a brand, and before I realized it, I had a fully running business, a successful one, a one that didn't only meet my expenditures. It made it possible for me to purchase my ideal setup, move into a gorgeous apartment, and above all, never worry about money again. Around that time, my parents started to abruptly recall me. It began when my mother sent me an unexpected SMS. "Hey, sweetie, how are you?" Mom said. To be sure I wasn't dreaming, I had to check my phone twice. It was the same woman who, 6 months prior, had thrown my possessions out as if I were a negligent renter. I decided not to answer. Another text message arrived a few days later. Mom sent Ryan a message. "A long time has passed. You are missed. How about we have supper together?" Do you miss me? I didn't remember them missing me, as I was fumbling to get my belongings out of a duffel bag, so it was funny. I disregarded the warning once more. Then the phone calls started. At first, I didn't respond to them. However, my curiosity overcame me, and I answered the phone after the 6th call in a single day. "Hi there." Mom's voice could be heard. "Too happy." "It's so lovely to hear your voice, Ryan. We were just discussing you." I gave a bland response. Before she began, there was a pause. "We simply wanted to see how you were doing and to check in. Perhaps you could visit us at some point." I grinned. "Do you mean my former home?" Before my dad cleared his throat in the background, there was an unsettling stillness. Dad raised his voice. "Ryan, we understand that things were a little difficult in the past, but we are still family, and family helps one another." Oh, it was a great line. I gently repeated what he had said. Family members help each other out. "I don't remember much support when you ejected me to give Eric my room." Mom sighed, as though I was the one acting irrationally. "That's fascinating. That's the past, Ryan. We believed it to be the greatest option at the time. But you do miss us? And the fact that I'm doing well now has nothing to do with this newfound concern for me?" I inquired. "Obviously not." But Mom's response was much too fast. "We have heard that things have been going really well for you since you brought it up. You are aware that when your aunt met up with one of your previous instructors, they expressed their pride in you. Isn't it fantastic? Yes, it was there. They had heard enough to know that I wasn't having any trouble, but they didn't know what I was really doing. They were now making an effort to re-enter my life. Nevertheless, I chose to comply. That's fascinating. Mom laughed apprehensively. Indeed. Why don't you come over for supper then? I'll prepare your preferred dish. We can all catch up. I feigned to consider it. Mom, I don't know. Is there room for me at all? After all, it's still where Eric and Karen reside. Quiet. Then she whispered in a much lower voice. About that anyhow. I arched an eyebrow. How about it? Dad sighed deeply before acknowledging that they had moved out. I almost laughed out loud. They did, of course, and I asked them to. Awaiting more. After hesitating, Mom eventually spoke clean. It's been a bit difficult. Although money has been difficult, your father and I have been providing them with financial support. Yes, it was there. And what am I supposed to do with that? I inquired. We simply thought that because you're doing so well, maybe you might help out a bit. Mom continued after another pause. Bingo. I blew a soft whistle. So let me clarify this. Since I was no longer a priority, you expelled me. But all of a sudden, I am now that I have money. Dad cut in right away. Ryan, that's unfair. You still have us as your parents. Oh, when you allowed Eric to use my room, were you still my parents? When Mom tossed my belongings outdoors, were you still my parents? When you didn't even check in on me for 6 months, were you still my parents? Quiet. Then Mom tried something else. We're not perfect, Ryan. However, you are loved by us, and we truly need your assistance right now. I smiled and leaned back. This was simply too fantastic, I must say. It's time to enjoy yourself. I enjoyed their distress on the other end of the telephone as I allowed the quiet to linger. I let out a final sigh while purposefully maintaining a calm tone. I must assist you. It's funny because you made it very apparent that I wasn't your top priority 6 months ago. That's what you told me directly. Do you recall that, Mother? Just before you began throwing my stuff outside? Ryan, it was. She paused. I interrupted her. What was that? Mom? An error? A poor choice? It was a decision. No. Eric was your first choice. You decided to let me go. You believe I owe you something now? Allow me to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. I owe you nothing at all. Please, Ryan. Even though my mother's voice wavered, I didn't believe it. Dad was the next to speak, his tone slipping into annoyance. You're being unappreciative, son. We reared you. We gave you everything. And now you abandon us when we need help. I laughed sharply and without humor. Oh, you want to discuss raising me now? That's intriguing, given that you didn't seem overly concerned when I was in dire need of a place to stay. And a little help. Keep me from laughing. You ignored me for half a year. The only reason you're reaching out now is because I'm financially stable. Just admit it for once. Another long silence followed before Mom's voice broke through again, sounding even more urgent this time. Please, Ryan, we're struggling. Your dad's hours at work were reduced, and we've been covering Eric's rent ever since he moved out. We're falling behind on expenses, and that's not my issue. I cut in. You made it perfectly clear that I wasn't part of this family anymore, so now you're no longer my responsibility either. Ryan, don't be like this. Mom pleaded, but I was already shaking my head even though they couldn't see it. You wanted me out of your life. Well, now you got what you wanted. Stay out of my. Good luck with it. I discontinued the call over the following few days. I disregarded every attempt they made to reach me. The deceitful messaging, the passive, hostile communications, even the ones pretending like nothing had ever occurred. I assumed they'd eventually quit trying. I was mistaken. One evening, while winding up some work, a loud, insistent banging rang around my flat. I scowled, moving my chair away from my desk. I wasn't expecting guests. A peculiar, unsettling feeling coiled in my gut as I approached the door and peeked through the crowds. There they were. My parents stood right outside. I froze. How did they discover me at all? I stood motionless, looking among the crowds, and I had never told them my address. My father banged again, more firmly this time. We know you're in there, Ryan. Go ahead and open the door. I remained still. Not even a breath left my body. My thoughts were racing. How had they discovered my residence? I never provided my address to them. I never put anything online that would give away where I was. But there they were, Mom holding onto her purse as if it were her sole source of support. With his jaw tightened in an all too familiar manner, Dad stood rigidly next to her. That indicated that he was hardly controlling his annoyance. One more knocking. This time, louder. "We're not going anywhere, Ryan." Dad gave a strong call. "Maybe you should allow us in." I briefly considered simply ignoring them, leaving, and acting as though I hadn't been there. However, I was acquainted with my parents. They persisted. They refused to quit, not when they needed me to do something. With a deep sigh, I pulled the door open after unlocking it. The second mother noticed me. She flinched. "Oh, Ryan, thank heavens." She let out a breath and moved closer as if she wanted to give me a hug. I didn't move. After a moment of hesitation, she returned her arms to her sides. I propped myself up against the door, crossed arms. "How did you discover me?" Dad cleared his throat. "Your sibling? I should have guessed. Eric and I hadn't spoken since I left, but I assumed he must have learned about it from someone we both knew or by looking through my old stuff." My stomach turned at the notion. I inhaled deeply. "What are you looking for?" Mom looked from me to Dad and back again. "Sweetheart, we need help, Ryan." "Yes, that is what I inferred from the constant missed calls." I gave a bland response and reiterated my lack of interest. Dad remarked in a quiet, serious voice, "Don't do this, Ryan. Your family is us." I laughed, but it was a sour chuckle. "We're family now." The last time I checked, it was humorous. To make room for their gold child, a real family doesn't cast out their child and scatter their possessions on the front yard. With a stern attitude, I met my mother's gaze. "Is that anything you've heard before?" She was so bold as to seem insulted. "Ryan, that's unfair. You were never expelled by us." "We?" "Yes, but you did." Before she could distort reality, I cut her off. "You took a stand. Eric was more important to you than me. You saw me as nothing more than a bother." Dad's face grew stern. "That is untrue." "Oh, really?" I posed a challenge. "Then describe this. Why didn't you even offer to let me crash on your couch? You're helping Eric, so why didn't you assist me too? Why didn't he find another place instead of stealing mine if he couldn't afford his own?" To that, they had no answer. Mom simply sighed instead. "Okay, Ryan, we made a few blunders. However, things have been quite difficult. We've been paying Eric's rent since he moved in, and your father hardly gets any shifts at work. Our debt is engulfing us. Everything is handled by the mortgage utility." I cocked my head. "And how precisely am I responsible for that?" She winced, as though she was shocked that I had said it. "We're in a difficult situation, Ryan. There is no one else to whom we may turn. And who is to blame for that?" I raised an eyebrow. "You destroyed all of our relationships. You made it quite evident that you didn't value me, that I was irrelevant. When Dad moved closer, I briefly believed he was going to try to intimidate me. There was no way that would work. No more. You can't really be this heartless, Ryan. I can relate to those who rejected me the moment I didn't meet their standards." I fixed my eyes on him. "I thought I was meant to follow your plan, attend college, and earn a degree. And you concluded that I was a lost cause of failure, Ryan, when I didn't, when I made my own decision. It's not. Don't hurt me." I interrupted Mom once again. "What's humorous, do you? I couldn't have helped you in the first place if I had followed your wishes and attended college. If I hadn't, I would be drowning in college loans. But instead, I created something for myself. All of a sudden, you care about me. I'm worthy of your attention now." Unspoken tears glistened in Mom's eyes. However, I refused to fall for it. "Not now." "We apologize, Ryan," she muttered. I took some time to observe her, allowing the stillness to linger. I shook my head after that. "No, you're not. All you're saying is that you're broke." She looked as though I had smacked her. Dad took a long breath, obviously attempting to control his annoyance. "We only need a little help, Ryan. Just enough to get us back on course." I ran a hand through my hair and let out a deep breath. "Do you need my assistance?" "Yes," Mom answered right away. I grinned. "This is what I propose. Get a job. Perhaps two." I did just that. Immediately, their expressions fell. "I'm done with this conversation, Ryan." As I stepped back inside my flat, I remarked forcefully, "Good luck and stay out of my life." I then closed the door in their faces without hesitation. For a long time, I stood there, waiting for them to knock again, heart racing. However, they didn't. Their footsteps retreated down the corridor a few minutes later. I breathed out slowly. It ought to have been gratifying. A tiny, resentful part of me still hurt, because, despite everything they had done, they were still my parents, even if I wanted it to, and I would always be just another source of money to them. I believed I had made myself quite clear, and that was the end of it. I was wrong, since they returned 3 days later. They weren't alone this time. They took Eric and his wife along this time. When I saw the 4 of them crammed together at my apartment door, I nearly burst out laughing. Mom had an optimistic expression. Dad looked annoyed. Eric, he was wearing the same arrogant, conceited expression he usually had when he thought he would win. And Emily, his wife, she was utterly incensed, as though she had been mistreated. I folded my arms and relaxed against the door frame while I slowly unlocked it. Whoa, a whole family get-together. What is the strategy? Did you think I would suddenly feel bad about bringing more people? Mom let out a sigh. Please, Ryan. She was in the middle of speaking when I held up a hand. Let's hear it, please. This time, what's the pitch? Since I've already said no, and yet you are all here. Eric took the initiative and took command of the issue. We're not here to quarrel, Guy. All we have to do is speak. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, so you would want to talk now? It's ironic, because you were the one accusing me of being conceited for occupying my space when we last spoke. In fact, Eric was so bold as to seem insulted. Nothing was taken by me, okay? That call came from Mom and Dad. Oh, I know, believe me. I grinned in response. They made it quite evident that you were more important than I was. And now you're all waiting for me to give you a scrap, queued up at my door like stray animals. Emily scoffing in a dramatic way. Stop being so theatrical, please. I shifted my attention to her. Too dramatic? Really? Do you want me to remind you that you threw everything I owned onto the grass? How you advised me to simply deal with it while looking me in the face? The audacity to roll her eyes. You're still focused on it, I see. I smiled. Oh, of course. Before Emily could worsen the situation, Dad cleared his throat. Let's go right to the point, Ryan. We are facing severe difficulties. I answered quite solemnly. Oh, I'm taking this very seriously. Really, I'm enjoying myself immensely. With a trembling sigh, Mom clasped her hands together as though in prayer. We are no longer able to pay the mortgage, Ryan. The home is in danger of going into foreclosure. Once more, it's your father's job, Emily and Eric. She paused and looked at them, as though expecting them to speak up, but all they did was look at the ground. Even though they've been doing their hardest, it's simply too much. This can't go on much longer. I feigned to consider the matter. Whoa, that sounds really regrettable. She gave a brief nod. Ryan is here. It's quite serious. Absolutely devastating, Eric continued. Yes, I shrugged nonchalantly after agreeing. I hope everything works out for you, though. Mom's face fell apart. Ryan. With a strong tone, I interrupted her. No, I'm not interested. I have nothing to repay you. Dad moved forward, obviously trying to employ his standard methods of intimidation. We mentioned you, Ryan. Oh, it's not even worth trying. My voice was cold and piercing as I snapped. You were required by law to provide for me, so you did. We call that parenting. It's not a bank account that you can take money out of whenever you want. Emily laughed. You're behaving like a little brat. I walked over to her. You and your spouse never learned how to manage their finances, so here you are, begging for money on my doorstep. I developed something for myself after leaving with nothing. You two played house at my cost in the interim. You're now deeply indebted. Eric's jaw tightened. Ryan, hurry up. We are related. I chuckled. That's amusing. Family is only brought up when you are in need. All of this, where? We have an attitude of unity. When my mother tossed everything I owned outdoors. When you removed my room, where was it? Without hesitation. To that, he had no response. Dad rubbed the bridge of his nose and groaned. We get it, Ryan. Can't you just admit that we made mistakes? I was cutting an absolute with my tone. You don't have the right to ignore me and then return whenever it suits you. You can't expect me to save you by treating me like I'm disposable. It appeared as though Mom was going to start crying. Please, Ryan. Just a little help. I lowered my voice and stepped forward slowly. How many times must I say the same thing? I don't give a damn. Emily folded her arms and scoffed again. Incredibly so. Will you honestly just sit back and let your own family suffer when you have more than enough money? I cocked my head a bit. Yes, she undoubtedly opened her tongue to insult me, but I interrupted her before she could say anything further. I stepped back inside, turned around, and briefly closed the door in their faces. I just listened while standing there. I heard sounds that were muted. Mom continues to beg. Something beneath his breath. Eric muttering. Dad sighed in frustration for a long time. Then, at last, footsteps. They departed. I ran a hand through my hair and let out a deep breath. I felt nothing at all this time. Not guilty. I have no regrets. Just tranquility. Their decision had been made. I had to at this point, and I'd never, ever turn around. But really, what a fantastic turn of events. I was being thrown away like yesterday's trash 1 second. My whole family was virtually groveling before my door the next day, as if I were their only hope. It was nearly funny. Nearly. What are everyone's thoughts? Was I too severe? Do you think I should have helped them a bit? Or were they deserving of all that shame? Because I feel like they hardly received what was due to them after what they did to me.